Hey everybody, your old pal Shawn here. In today's episode, we're going to talk about self-honesty, shadow work, extremism, and a lot more. But before we get started, if you like what we're doing, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you think about these episodes. Tell me if there's a topic you want me to cover, something I'm missing. Put it in the comments. Share it with as many people as you can. We're trying to get this message out, trying to make the world a better place and head in a better direction. If you're in a good financial position and want to support the podcast, please check out our givesendgo.com/SZP. It acts kind of like a Patreon. And the idea behind this is just anything that comes in is going to go back to the podcast, maybe towards having people edit videos, perhaps towards more training for myself, or better set. There are many opportunities to improve the quality of this production, so we definitely want to bring you higher and higher quality service. Now, let's get started. If you think back and take a moment of reflection, you can think of times when you believed in things that you don't believe in now. Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny. Maybe you really thought that your first partner was going to be the one, and no one's ever going to understand you the way they do, and no one ever loved the way that you loved. We've all had different moments where there were things that we subscribed to that we don't. Maybe we were advocates for a certain diet, a certain religious path, or a particular exercise program. We would see things in black and white. If you're not on this diet, you're an idiot. You're going to destroy your health. If you're not doing this type of exercise program, engaged in this multi-level marketing thing, or doing this business venture, if you're not meditating and getting therapy and getting your self-care, setting that as a priority, you are mistaken. You don't know what you're talking about. You're an idiot just going through the motions. There's so many of these different things that become very important to us. And as we mature, as we go on, our views on some of these things change. At one point, if you're involved in a certain group, maybe you're going to a church, maybe it's a yoga studio or some fitness club that you're in. And if somebody is doing something inappropriately in those groups, immediately there's often a reflex to come up like, no, I know that person. They wouldn't do that. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they're falsely accused, bad evidence, they're set up. But many times that person really did do something, and they really were in some way affiliated with us. Whether they went to the same, maybe they volunteered in the same place you did, or went to school with you, or took a class with you. Perhaps you worked together and they were real helpful. And maybe you share some ethnic or cultural similarities. And when someone points out, hey, the leader of the yoga teacher, he's always doing the stretches with the young girls and adjusting them in questionable ways. But yeah, nothing's reported, and everyone's real mature. He just wants to help out. Or does he? It's so easy for us to want to see ourselves and everyone affiliated with us in the right light. And this is one of the powerful things that kept the Catholic Church safe from having its reputation stained by the many, many priests and cardinals and bishops who were involved in abuse of children. People would say, hey, don't say, parents would say to their kids, don't lie about Father O'Malley like that. You're going to go to hell. Do you know how many people you're going to chase away from the loving arms of Jesus? You stay quiet. But because there wasn't enough self-honesty and enough introspection and enough willingness to say, hey, the organization does a lot of charitable things. There are really great priests and practitioners and bishops and monks and nuns and all of the like. But there are also people who succumb to the temptations available to them in stations of power. And there are people who begin sometimes as predatory and have gotten involved because of the opportunities, taking up the robe, so to speak, provides them. And we all have to be honest about different things, like when we are wrong, when we make mistakes. And we all have within us the potential for our own evil and our own corruption. And people don't like to hear this. And this isn't me saying, oh, ho, ho, look at me, I have achieved perfect. No. This is me as somebody who's been wrong a million times. Who spent decades hating himself because of what I've seen inside and things that I ended up doing. We all have our own potential for darkness. And we're not going to do a deep exercise here. That wouldn't be appropriate. I don't know the backgrounds of whoever's going to watch this video, and won't be able to provide care, and not every exercise is fitting for every person. However, I could give you some background. If there is a tragic event like a school shooting, how many of us will see this happen and wish we could have been there? Wish we could have, as John Wick, violently punished the shooters. Or you could look at a terrorist attack, or you could look at any number of the countless people who have done horrendous, horrific, terrible things in the world. And when we look at this and we feel that pain inside, there's something that you might not be aware of, but if you look long enough, honestly enough, you begin to find something like, at what point does the anger come up? Does the wish to do harm come up? So I used to do an exercise. I called it the hammer meditation. And it was just an introductory technique to get people to realize at what point some of these inclinations might rise. Because for a lot of us who want to be good people, we would take up any amount of punishment. We might say, oh, well, the idea behind a hammer meditation would be they're sitting there someone's sitting there in a chair, and you have a hammer. And at what point does the desire to hit the person with the hammer come up? And there's some people who would just do it for fun. And there are some people who, oh, I heard that person was talking shit about me. And then they would do it. And there are some people who would, well, if they took a swing at me, I'd hit them with the hammer. And there are some people who, if they stole something from me or stole some precious heirloom from that my grandmother left me, then I'd hit them with the hammer. And you would go on. And it's not a mental thing. At some point, I'm not guiding people through this because that wouldn't be appropriate. But it's a felt experience. And I would guide people into feeling, hey, what do you feel at these different levels of intensity? And there are many of us who would even tolerate even life-threatening things to ourselves without wanting to do harm to somebody. But the moment that is projected towards a dog or a cat or a child or someone we care about, then different degrees of this vindictiveness, this capacity for violence begins to rise up. Where if we had power and there was no possible punishment for it, at what point would we pick up the hammer? And it's a fairly simple exercise, but when done with honesty repeatedly a few times, we can find our personal edge or how consistent would a certain behavior have to be before we say enough is enough. And then we want to cross a certain line. And I'm not advocating for any kind of violence, but we all have the capacity within us. And if we think we don't, that's the very dangerous thing. People who know they have a certain vulnerability can at least make an effort to compensate for it, to put guardrails and boundaries around their life so that doesn't rise up. Some people say, oh, I don't drink tequila because every time I do, that gets me going. Or I don't watch the news because that gets me riled up. We become aware of the points where we could start to build up. Now, here's part of the thing. When there's a tragic event like a school shooting, we might have something like this stirred up because we want to protect the kids. We don't want some monster to come for them. And, even the survivors, they have survivor's guilt and trauma, and they're haunted sometimes in their nightmares forever. And you think, oh, I'd show those guys. And if we had power and there could be no punishment, the things we would do. But we also have a whole spectrum of different state and different emotions. At what point would we take money? At what point would we give in to sexual opportunities, even though they might conflict with our moral boundaries? How bad can your day be, and how many times must you be offered exactly what you want before you take it? We all have capacity to want to be seen as special. We all have a capacity to want to be lazy or to want to amass all the resources, to want to be violent, to want to capitalize on sexual opportunities. And some of these are stronger than others in different people. We all have our own areas of particular vulnerability. And that's good to be aware of. Now, we've all also have done things that we don't approve of. I mean, let's just start very, very mild. If we're honest, we all have things that we know we should do that we don't do. You should forgive Uncle Ted for getting drunk at the wedding, but maybe you don't. You should, he's family, but you don't. Maybe it's you lie in certain situations and you shouldn't, but you don't want to upset anybody. You don't want to make waves, so you stay quiet. Maybe there's a particular cause that's really important to you, but you won't say anything about it because you're afraid of what other people think. Maybe you want to get in shape and you just love eating ice cream. So you just keep eating tubs of ice cream. We all have different ideas of what we should do and have at some point not done. And we've also done things that we feel ashamed about. Now, if you're on the psychopathic end, this isn't me judging you, but seems to be less prevalent, I'll say, charitably. Maybe things you feel ashamed about or embarrassed about, or things we feel guilty about. Like, oh, I said a mean thing to a friend. I cut off somebody in traffic because I was really mad and I was running late. I ran over a duck because it was either that or hit somebody's car. Or I bullied somebody in school because everybody else was doing it. Or I took some money out of the church money plate when it was coming around because I could use a few bucks. We've all done different things that we feel we could have done better at the very least. So right now we're just building a foundation for self-honesty. And now we can also be honest about the fact that there are certain situations where we can be very petty, very vindictive. Maybe even with a romantic partner, for example, who never takes the trash out and never does the dishes. Or if they do it, they don't do the dishes right. Or they don't fold the laundry just right. So you're angry about that. Or why do they always leave their fucking shoes over there? We all have different levels of where we can become petty, or where we can become vindictive, or when we become mean. And sometimes we can do that and justify that because, well, the ends justify the means. These people have to be stopped at any cost. Or, this guy was taking advantage of a lot of people, so I had to sabotage him. Because in the long run, fewer people get hurt because of that. And this isn't me, once again, I'm not judging, thinking I'm better than anybody. Far from it. We're just beginning to open the door for self-honesty. Now, we can also be honest about the fact that there are people that could be loosely affiliated with us who might have some reprehensible views, particularly if they've been hurt, they've been through a bad relationship, they've been traumatized, they had some kind of abuse from a certain group of people or some constituency of that group of people. There could be people on our side who take things to an extreme, or who have been in an echo chamber too long, they've been hurting and alone for too long, and they just ended up in a really dark place. This is important for us to recognize. We like to think that we are safe, that everything's crystal clear, black and white, right or wrong. But some of our views are not always right. Some of the things we do or think are wrong. And sometimes when we're hurt, we do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. Or sometimes when we feel something we care about's in danger, we might not bother getting all the facts. And then we'd lash out at whoever we imagine to be the perpetrator, right or wrong. This is the danger. A lot of us don't have this self-honesty. If we would bring up any of the major issues of the day, the economy, the tariffs, the war in Ukraine, the situation in Gaza, I'll call that a war too. I didn't mean to downgrade that for people. The race, immigration, gender, the environment, animal rights, future of children, education, whatever your primary issues are, there are limitations to what we know. And people could be familiar with different information. Might be wrong information, by the way, but they could be familiar with inaccurate information. And that could rile them up. That could get them very excited. We've all heard the stereotypical kind of thing. Us, when we see a tragic event like a school shooting, we get hurt. We're upset about it. But the thing with extremists is, while we get upset and we kind of spike up in intensity, we eventually calm down. The thing with extremists is they have this tension rising. And most of the time, it doesn't drop down because they become aware of another instance, or they relive the same event over and over and over again. And instead of settling down to a base level of tension that's quite low, they stay at a very high level of agitation for very, very long periods of time, and that warps them. And this gives you the stereotypical, though sometimes reported inaccurately, thing with school shooters. There's the old, oh, well, all the jocks used to pick on the weird kid, and, after years, the weird kid struck back. Now, sometimes the stories are reported like that, and sometimes that's actually not what happened. But you get the point. Very often, someone will become aware of some piece of information that they focus on. Maybe they have a radical news source they go to. Or maybe when they see one thing is reported inaccurately. And then maybe that causes them to question everything. And then they end up going down some really bleak, nihilistic rabbit hole. You see, there are people who roughly agree with a lot of the things that we agree with, but they've been agitated so frequently. They're so cynical or so nihilistic at a certain point that they become extreme. They become more fringe. And it happens on all sides. I still think it's maybe 1.5%, 2% each side. But, maybe that's going up. Or at least awareness of that's going up. We have so much information now that something that would have happened anyway 30 years ago, but would have stayed confined at a local level because of all of our technology, we become aware of them and we think, oh, this wasn't happening 30 years ago. When in fact it was. It just wasn't being reported on TikTok, on YouTube, by a bunch of streamers, by different influencers who are financially incentivized to report on things that are going to make us upset. And there's a reason for all of this self-honesty. And by the way, I am not saying that any individual person is responsible for all the woes of the world. But I'm saying that when millions of people participate in relatively minor behaviors, that has a far larger collective effect. It's fun to send memes to your friends about how the side you don't like is how they're stupid or ignorant or have no idea what's going on. And then you and your friends will go, those people are so dumb. But the thing is, those memes get around. And you might not say, well, oh, I'm smart enough. I'm not influenced by a meme. Okay. But if you share a couple thousand memes over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, well, that begins to have an imprint, a pretty substantial one. If a comedian has a really funny routine that they put together knocking a certain side, and you want to share that. The whole thing about comedians is we all have funny situations in our lives. And if you're a comedian, you want to take some of the funniest situations and exaggerate it. Like a professional wrestler would enhance their personality to make them bigger and wilder than they actually are. Well, a comedian will take some of the situations we encounter in life that can be pretty wild and just push it up a couple notches and tell you about it. They could take situations that are very tense and just tell a funny joke, play to their crowd that agrees with them, and it's going to work. And they're going to get money, and then they're going to have more jokes like that. And by the way, I'm not saying to deplatform anybody. I'm not trying to say you can't send a meme. But if you have 10,000 thoughts about a person or a group being terrible, that is powerfully going to influence how you think and how you communicate about those people. Did you ever hear a rumor that got you upset, but it turned out not to be true? For example, if someone said, oh, your partner used to be with this person, or that, and they hung out last night. Now that might not even be true, but you hear that and like, no. Well, imagine if somebody you like, maybe a friend, maybe a partner, maybe an influencer that you think is funny or insightful or witty, and they make some comment or some observation, and they say, hey, you can't trust person X because they are such idiots. Look what they did. And they'll give some example out of context, and you go, and you're more likely to believe it because you like the person who told you. And could it be that they're misinformed? Yeah. And could it be perhaps people that you agree with on different issues might also have beliefs that are pretty extreme? Yeah. You might have dear old Uncle Ted, who's always been good to you, kind, helps you move, lots of different things. But at the same time, he makes some comments about cultural figures that you find really offensive. Now, is Uncle Ted an outright evil person because he makes some of these comments? Probably not. And if you just say, Ted, come on, you're evil, how dare you? Is that going to convince Ted to be less radical? No. What might is building relationships with him. Talking about, once in a while, talking about good experiences you've had to the contrary. And little by little, that has more of an impact than isolating Uncle Ted and sentencing him to an echo chamber where he just hangs out with people who completely agree with his views, and then they keep repeating it over and over again and to get more extreme. You see, as a society and our culture, people make tons of money discrediting, insulting, belittling different figures, different groups. There's lots of money to be made that way. But it's unfortunate because every time we do it, we begin to contribute in our own small way to the world getting worse. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't call out corruption or stand up for what you believe in. This is not an argument that I'm making. But what I am saying, and this is complicated, is we just want to believe things are black and white. If there's one group we want to support, we want to say, they're always right, the other people are always wrong. And sometimes, if we're a little more honest, we might say, oh yeah, well, once in a great while, there's somebody who steps out of line, but that's the fringe, super rare exception. But when you have enough self-honesty, we can see that there are people on our side who are making the world worse. And we can see that we are contributing to that by making the posts, by sending the memes, by shitting on the different people over and over again, by saying how bad they are, how dumb they are, how woke they are, how bigoted they are, what have you. And what that does is it begins to isolate people. And then they just look for people who will agree with them. Now, if you have a great relationship with someone and you intermittently share little points of contention, that can begin to mix their views on you. But it could also, if you're really good at maintaining the relationship and being cool, it could also open their minds to different perspectives on the things that would keep they're pushing them more radical. You see, when you silence people, when you deplatform them, when you isolate them, they don't go away. They get more bitter. And then they tend to listen to people who are already fringe. And then we're gradually making the world worse. As I said in a previous video, if you're on the left, years of not taking questions about trans issues, not taking the idea of border security seriously, years of, for example, let's talk about men's issues. Yes, there are many, 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 many men who are predatory, 100%. And there are many circumstances where men are privileged or biased towards where they have advantages. Absolutely. And I'm not saying any of that's good, and I'm not saying we shouldn't find ways to make headway to move beyond that. But what I am saying is certain ways of communicating about that aren't heard through the most sophisticated lens. When we talk about toxic masculinity, and when we start to say that general behaviors of men are toxic, and that they have to become more feminine, that begins to radicalize a certain amount of people. If it was communicated in a certain way, like, hey, we know there are many excellent men, but we're taking a stand because there are many people who are men who've done inappropriate things, and now we want to shift the balance a bit. That's a very different discussion than just the bumper sticker, toxic masculinity. And I'm not saying there aren't men that are toxic. There are tons. And I'm also saying that by isolating and shitting on people, you make more of them toxic. we contribute to the toxicity by the way we communicate about it. And by the way, there are also a lot of women who've gone to prison for doing terrible things. We don't talk about toxic femininity, because it's not as catchy. But people could come up with examples. And because we don't have this open discussion, like, hey, there are people who are men who do shitty things. There are people who are women who do shitty things. Because we don't keep that door open. Then automatically we begin to push the sexes apart and create a divide there, creating more tension and making both sides a little more extreme. There's a big difference between raising an issue of, and this particular law shows favoritism towards men, and we need to change that. And telling your daughters that men are bad and this type of thing. Now, so many of my friends who are women have been assaulted or harassed or stalked by men. So I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I also know guys who've been hit and struck by women and taking advantage of the fact that they have legal protections and men can't hit back because everything in the world tells you not to. There are women who take advantage of their situations too. And we just have to acknowledge that, hey, there are predatory people on every side. Now, how can we address the situation for the masses and begin to make structures to accommodate the more marginalized ends of the group? Little by little, we all contribute to extremism. And that's not where we want to go. That's not the world we want to make. Instead, we should strive to make the world a better place. Instead of adhering to quick slogans that will come to mean many things to different people. You see, one of the things we talk about in interpersonal relationships is, you have to be honest and you have to be vulnerable and you have to be open and yada, yada, yada. Well, culturally, we're not. We're not good at doing this at that level. We can't say, hey, I'm going to make up a conflict and I hope it's not real. The Egyptian war, the people on the pro-Egyptian side are the ones in the right. But some of the people there are really doing terrible things. They're really taking advantage of the upheaval. Okay. Now, I understand when we communicate about issues, we can't always go back to acknowledging and what we're for, what we're against. You have to, at some point, advance with the main points of the topic. But it's so easy to try and paint things as black and white. To try and describe the world through a certain lens. if we want to make the world a better place, we have to understand that even the way we think about people who we disagree with somehow contributes in nudging the world towards greater conflict. Somehow contributes to, oh, I just created and sent out this meme about how shitty the other side is. And when you do that, that's radicalizing both sides. That's making people more extreme. Now, it's very small, that one act. It's not a major thing. But when you have, 50 million people doing it, and when you have whole stations dedicated to pumping out a certain message, when you have videos designed to go viral because they have the most emotionally provoking content and thumbnails, yeah, they'll make a lot of money, but they'll push the world down a darker path. We have to have some more self-honesty. And part of that is through our introspection. This awareness that, yes, we can be petty. We can be bitter. We can not want to hear other information. We could cover our ears and say, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. Everything else is wrong. Well, even if it's wrong, you have to be aware of the propaganda that's out there so that you could create a narrative that addresses it. You see, when we are exposed to the ideas of the opposing sides, when we can speak to those, when we can see when they call out extremists on our side, we can realize, okay, things aren't always black and white. Sometimes we are in the wrong. Sometimes our strategy might not have historically worked out in other situations. That's why they have a concern. But instead of doing that, we're quick to demonize. We'll have oversimplified narratives. If someone, for example, might have a different strategy in mind for how to address climate change, what's common is just to not listen to their other strategy, just call them climate deniers and anti-science, and instead of actually hearing what the other view is and understanding that, oh, well, maybe that view is compelling to some people. The way that moves the world forward would be, okay, well, let's address the ideas raised in their new proposal and see where there's merit or not. Instead of starting from the place of, oh, you're always wrong, and I'm going to belittle you. Sometimes our most cherished beliefs are not accurate. And sometimes that means the fact that we've always liked to be on the side of the right side of of history. We want to think, oh, we're protecting the disadvantaged. We are fighting against the empire. And in principle, who in the world is not for that? But the thing is, everyone thinks they're fighting against the empire. Everyone believes they're on the side of right. And when we do that deep soul searching, we can see sometimes we're in error, or at least if strategically what we're doing might be the most effective tactic. At the level of psychological warfare, at the level of social influence, it's not. Every time we turn our nose up at the other side, whatever issue you have, we're consciously deciding we're not going to reach more people. We're consciously deciding we're not going to strive to build a bridge, to befriend them, to get them out of their echo chamber and share ideas. Now, the way to do that is through mutual openness. And that'd be ideal. However, as Daryl Davis proved, and as I keep going back to over and over again, even with extremists who are against you, by being relentlessly, ruthlessly cool and friendly and supportive, and by listening, that opens a lot of doors that bigotry and hatred will never open. We all have our points where we're more vulnerable. Times when we want to be violent. Times when we want to be lazy. Times when we want to take advantage of our position. When we want to say, do you know who you think you're talking? Do you know who you're talking to? Times when we want to get the attention. Times, and none of these inherently are bad. These are patterns that have been repeated over and over and over again. So I want to share with you one last key idea on this podcast. And so we're going to talk about different ideas of truth. Now, there's one kind of truth like mathematical truth. 1 + 1 = 2. Or a scientific thing. You know, if you hold a ball up and you let go, it's eventually going to fall. Okay, this is something that's been proven and demonstrated many, many, many times. We have an understanding of that. That's a kind of truth. But there's another type of truth. That's a more psychological, personal. And I'm not speaking of, my personal truth. I personally don't think we all get our own version of reality. Although we could get our own perception of reality, but that's a different thing. Everyone's ideas are not equally valid. Just because a person suffered a lot does not make them an expert. You could take an individual who lost all of their relatives to heart disease, who themselves suffer from heart disease, who are really afraid of it, who've experienced so much pain because of heart disease. That doesn't necessarily make them a cardiologist. That doesn't make them a heart surgeon. That doesn't make them an expert on the topic. That in and of itself means they've suffered a lot because of this circumstance. That does not mean that their feelings make them more accurate about the solution. That doesn't mean they understand anatomy or nutrition or biology or physical defects or physical trauma. That doesn't mean that they're suddenly super informed. It just means that they're hurting. But there's a kind of thing that we do that's functionally true. And what do I mean by functionally true? I mean, there are situations where we develop an idea or a belief that serves us a practical benefit, but it's not accurate. So let me give you an example. Someone had a bad relationship. They got hurt. And her functional truth might become all men are bad. Well, that's not accurate. You know, she loves her father, her grandfather, her brother. You know, her best friend's a guy. You know, she has many, but she develops to believe all men are bad as like a shelter, psychological shelter from the pain that was caused by the guy that she had a bad relationship with. And some people, it might be a little more nuanced, like all white guys are bad, or all guys of this socioeconomic status are bad, or all wild guys are bad, or all boring guys are bad. But it serves a certain functional truth. You might have somebody who had a bad response to a certain medication. And they'll say, that medicine's bad. It should never, ever be taken. It's terrible. It's bad. Because it's a belief. They got hurt by it. And so they think it should be off the market. That doesn't mean it's not an appropriate thing for certain cases. but we will generalize. It helps us be a little more safe, even though it serves to shrink the world, give us fewer opportunities, fewer information, but it seems to reduce vulnerability. It seems to mitigate the opportunities for pain and give us greater control over our lives. So things that are functionally true may not be factually true. And so we'll do this in countless situations. Might be, oh, people should never do this exercise because I've got hurt on it and other people have gotten hurt on it. Well, it could also be true that the technique wasn't good. It could be true that the range of motion, the volume, or the intensity was too much for the preparation of those tissues that were involved. That's a more nuanced view, but a lot of people would say, just quick, black and white, that exercise is bad. Or everyone who goes to church is good. And then you get like the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, who was a proud and happy member of the church who loved to bind, torture, and kill people. We like to oversimplify things. We like to think, oh, if someone is working for Disney, they're there to help children. Well, we know now there's a certain amount of people who get involved in these types of networks because it gives them access to children. And they're actually predatory. We oversimplify so many things. We have these generalized narratives in our minds to help guide us. And at certain points, they can be helpful. They might serve to, okay, you could trust everybody here. And that could help somebody to open up. But maybe you could trust 99% of the people there. And, you know, certain individuals are not as wholesome, shall I say. There are many things that can be functionally true, but in the sense that they serve a purpose. Men are bad. Women are crazy. I'm not saying none of these are I'm not saying these are accurate, but these are beliefs people develop that will give them a certain sense of security. I'll just stay away from women, they're crazy. You know, they'll just take your money and make false reports about you and hurt you. You know, you'll feel so good, you'll feel so much love, but she's just setting you up, man. And that's going to lead you down a dark road. We have to look at some of our beliefs that are functionally true in the sense that they keep us from being exposed to ideas that hurt. They keep us from being exposed to situations that could hurt. They keep us in situations that we feel good about. But at the end of the day, we suffer. We suffer a great deal because we've cut ourselves off from the world and from life. And is that what we really want? Is that what we're trying to do? When we analyze our beliefs about things that are functionally true, we might say, oh, well, there's a lot of good people involved. We might turn a blind eye to the masses of people who are doing harm, like so many did with the Catholic Church for decades. We have to be able to analyze our sacred cows and go through a process of investigation. What are things that I think are functionally true, but might not be? Do I have beliefs that are well-intentioned, but are actually setting the course for destruction? You know, I want to think that I'm a good person, but I am a good person and we'll say, oh, that's functionally true. But that doesn't mean you don't have thoughts that are destructive, have feelings that are destructive, occasionally do things that, even in a very minor way, are harmful. Maybe we've said or done something to a sibling or a parent or a relative that we later came to regret. Or maybe we think we're perfectly justified doing that because of some other infraction that they've committed. But we have to be honest about our capacity for being on the wrong side and doing things that even violate our own values. How we might be the villains of somebody's story. How somebody could actually be a good person and we're just refusing to see it. Whether it's because of their zodiac sign, or their political party, or their race or gender or age or financial status, their level of education. You might say, oh, for example, I only want to be with educated people because uneducated people are so stupid. And many of the most brilliant people in the world didn't have a classical education, didn't get degrees. But that doesn't mean their intellectual contributions weren't huge. But that's something that could be generally true. Generally, people who have a good education might be more informed, might be more intellectual. In some cases, they might also be biased to certain ideologies that have been repeated often in their education. Repeated so often that they feel familiar, that they feel comfortable with it, that they get a sense of that's how it is. But is that the truth? Or is that a functional truth that's leading us on the road to hell? We all have the capacity, if we're deeply honest, to participate in evil wittingly or unwittingly. We all have the capacity to weigh things a certain way. You know, if you look at one of the wars, you might look at the side that you oppose and say, yeah, bomb those people. Okay, well, there's innocent women and children on that side. And you just made a moral calculation that so you're okay with killing women and children. Collateral damage, and we could justify it. We could say collateral damage. We could say many different things. We could say, oh, well, they started it. We could say, well, there's a historical precedent in the region. But there are different ways we can make very dark calculations. And I'm not saying you're bad for it. We all do this kind of thing. But the more we strive to speak of and think of the bottom line that we are all part of one greater human family, that these people on the other sides of these issues that are so important to us are our estranged brothers and sisters who have had different life experiences, who have been informed in ways contrary to how we have been. And it's our job not to shit on them, not to condemn them, not to push them into echo chambers of extremism, not to isolate them or silence them or deplatform them or censor them or jail them, but to build bridges to them, to reach out to them, to connect to them, to see them as the human being that they are. To be relentlessly cool, to be an example of goodness on the other side that can begin to pull them out of the black and white into the shades of gray where they can understand that there is goodness on your side too. Just as there's goodness on their side. Everything's not so easy black and white. Everything's very messy, very complicated, and we don't like to feel that. We don't like to feel like we could be wrong. We don't like to feel like we could do harm. We don't like to feel like we're not a good person. But we're all making these calculations all the time. And we want to oversimplify it and say, oh, everyone on that side is a bigot or a racist or anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or anti-black or anti-white or anti-man, anti-woman. They're transphobic, cisphobic, whatever you want to say. And just because there are some people who could be categorized on the other side who would fall under that, that does not mean that everyone there is that far to the extreme. And just because someone is currently on the fringe, on the extremist side, that does not mean that they cannot find their way home and see you once again as their brother, their sister, their extended family. If we have the humility to see our own capacity for being wrong, our own capacity for being malicious or petty or vindictive or vulnerable or corrupted, and the other side's capacity to have good intentions, to fight for something that they think is important, to defend what they their families, their cultures, their backgrounds. We could definitely make great strides to moving our world in a better direction, down a path of unity and out of the shadow of darkness. Thank you very much. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please give me some feedback. I want to hear what you think. As always, rock on, party on. This is Shawn, signing out.